On a humid afternoon in September 1993, construction workers in a small Alabama town broke through a basement wall and discovered something that would reopen one of the most mysterious unsolved crimes in federal history. Wrapped in newspapers from 1958 and sealed inside a rusted metal box were 23 gold bars worth nearly $2 million at the time of their disappearance. The bars had been hidden there for 35 years, buried in the foundation of a home that had been lovingly restored by a couple who had no idea they were living above one of the most sought-after treasures in the South. James and Lila Carter had lived in that house since 1978, raising their children in rooms they'd rebuilt with their own hands. They'd painted over water stains, replaced rotted beams, and turned an abandoned wreck into a family home. For 15 years, they walked across floors that concealed a fortune. They celebrated birthdays in a living room built over buried gold. They planted gardens in soil that held secrets deeper than tree roots. The discovery didn't just shock the Carters. It resurrected a ghost story that law enforcement had buried decades earlier, the tale of Elias "Smoke" Turner, a Birmingham mechanic who vanished after orchestrating the cleanest federal gold robbery Alabama had ever seen. Turner had disappeared in October 1958, leaving behind only questions and a cold trail that went nowhere. The FBI had assumed he fled the country or died trying. They never imagined he'd hidden the gold in his uncle's abandoned house, or that it would sit untouched while families came and went, while children grew up, while the world moved on. What the Carters found beneath their basement wasn't just gold. It was proof that sometimes the greatest hiding place isn't across borders or buried in remote wilderness. Sometimes it's right where everyone can see it, beneath the foundation of an ordinary home in an ordinary town, waiting for someone to dig just a little deeper. Before we dive deeper into this incredible story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Elias Turner was born in Birmingham, Alabama in 1923, the oldest of three brothers in a working-class family that struggled through the Depression. His father worked the steel mills until an accident left him partially disabled. His mother took in laundry to make ends meet. Elias learned early that survival meant being smarter than everyone else in the room. By his 20s, Elias had earned a reputation as one of the finest mechanics in Jefferson County. He could diagnose an engine problem by sound alone and fix transmissions that other shops declared hopeless. He worked at Patterson's Auto Repair on the east side of Birmingham, a modest shop that serviced everything from delivery trucks to police vehicles. Customers trusted him. Shop owners relied on him. He was quiet, methodical, and never caused trouble. But Elias Turner had a gift that went beyond fixing engines. He had an eye for systems, for patterns, for the invisible machinery that kept institutions running. While other mechanics saw carburetors and brake lines, Elias saw opportunity. In early 1958, Patterson's Auto Repair won a contract to service vehicles for the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta's Birmingham branch. The contract included maintenance on armored transport trucks that moved currency and precious metals between facilities. Elias was assigned to the fleet. For 6 months, he serviced brake systems, changed oil, and rotated tires on the same trucks that carried millions in gold and silver along predetermined routes through northern Alabama. He paid attention to details others overlooked. He noticed the trucks always departed on Thursdays. He saw that the same 2 guards worked the morning shift. He observed that the convoy took Highway 78 through rural stretches where radio communication was spotty and backup was 20 minutes away at best. He learned that protocol required the trucks to stop at a way station outside Jasper, creating a predictable delay in their schedule. Elias didn't share what he was learning. He didn't write anything down. He simply filed information away in his mind, piece by piece, until a plan began to form. In the spring of 1958, Elias began recruiting. He needed men he could trust, men desperate enough to take a risk, but disciplined enough to follow orders. He chose carefully. There was Raymond Hayes, a former army driver who'd returned from Korea with nerves too shot to hold a steady job. There was Calvin Booker, a dock worker whose gambling debts had him drowning. And there was Jerome Mitchell, Elias's youngest brother, who'd followed Elias his whole life and would follow him into anything. Elias presented the plan in pieces, never revealing the full picture until everyone had committed. They would intercept a gold transport on October 16, 1958, along a remote stretch of Highway 78 between Birmingham and Jasper. They would use a staged accident to force the truck to stop. They would overwhelm the guards quickly, without violence if possible. They would transfer the gold to a waiting vehicle and disappear into the back roads before anyone knew what happened. The others asked questions. Elias had answers for everything. He'd mapped escape routes. He'd identified blind spots in radio coverage. He'd calculated response times down to the minute. His confidence was absolute, and it spread to the others like fever. On the morning of October 16, 1958, a Thursday, an armored transport truck left the Federal Reserve facility in Birmingham carrying gold bars destined for a secure vault in Memphis. The shipment included 23 bars of pure gold, each weighing approximately 27 pounds, with a combined value of nearly $2 million. 2 armed guards sat in the cab. A third rode in back with the cargo. At 9:45 in the morning, as the truck approached a sharp curve on Highway 78 near the town of Dora, the driver spotted what appeared to be a serious accident ahead. A pickup truck had collided with a station wagon, blocking both lanes. A man was lying in the road, apparently injured. The driver slowed, then stopped. That's when everything happened at once. Raymond Hayes, who'd been playing the injured man, rolled to his feet. Calvin Booker emerged from the tree line with a shotgun. Jerome Mitchell appeared from behind the disabled pickup. Elias Turner stepped out of the station wagon, calm and commanding. He walked directly to the driver's window and spoke in a voice that left no room for argument. The guards could cooperate and walk away unharmed, or they could resist and force a situation nobody wanted. The guards saw 4 men, 2 firearms, and no way out. They saw the calculation in Elias's eyes and understood they weren't dealing with amateurs. After a tense 30 seconds, the driver unlocked the doors. The transfer took less than 8 minutes. The crew worked with military precision, moving the gold bars from the armored truck to a modified panel van hidden in the trees. They used bolt cutters on the security cage, loaded the bars into crates lined with blankets to muffle sound, and secured everything with rope and tarps. Elias supervised every movement, checking his watch, scanning the road, keeping everyone focused. When the last bar was loaded, Elias did something unexpected. He apologized to the guards. He told them they'd done the smart thing. Then he and his crew drove away, leaving the guards handcuffed to the disabled vehicles with keys hidden nearby, but not immediately accessible. By the time the guards freed themselves and radioed for help, the gold was gone. The robbery made national headlines within hours. The FBI descended on Birmingham, treating the case as a federal priority. Agents interviewed everyone connected to the Federal Reserve facility, everyone who worked on the transport trucks, everyone who might have inside knowledge of the routes. Within 2 weeks, they had Raymond Hayes in custody. His fingerprints were on the pickup truck. Within another week, they'd arrested Calvin Booker, whose ex-wife turned him in for the reward money. Jerome Mitchell was caught trying to cross into Mexico with $3,000 cash he couldn't explain. All 3 men eventually talked. They described the plan, the execution, the man who'd orchestrated everything. They gave investigators Elias Turner's name, but when agents went to arrest Elias, they found his apartment cleaned out. His landlord said he'd left in the middle of the night, 2 days after the robbery, taking only what he could carry. His pickup truck was found abandoned near the Tennessee state line. His bank account had been emptied the morning of the heist. Nobody at Patterson's Auto Repair had seen him since the day before the robbery. Elias Turner had vanished as completely as the gold. The FBI launched a manhunt that stretched across state lines. They checked bus stations, train depots, border crossings. They interviewed family members, old girlfriends, army buddies. They distributed wanted posters throughout the South. They offered rewards. They followed leads that went nowhere. Months passed, then years. The case went cold. Investigators theorized that Elias had either fled to Mexico or Cuba, or that he died shortly after the robbery, possibly killed by unknown accomplices who wanted the gold for themselves. The bars themselves were never recovered. None of them ever surfaced on black markets. None were ever sold or melted down, as far as anyone could determine. Eventually, the FBI classified the case as unsolved. Elias Turner became a legend in Alabama, the man who'd pulled off the perfect heist and disappeared into thin air, taking $2 million in gold with him. But Elias Turner hadn't fled to Mexico. He hadn't fled anywhere at all. What investigators didn't know, what they couldn't have known, was that Elias had never planned to run. Running meant borders and checkpoints and papers that could be traced. Running meant living as a fugitive forever, always looking over your shoulder, always one mistake away from capture. Elias had a different plan. He would hide the gold where no one would think to look, and then he would simply cease to exist. 3 days after the robbery, Elias drove to a property on the outskirts of a small town called Brookwood, 40 miles south of Birmingham. The property belonged to his uncle Henry, his mother's older brother, who'd inherited the old family homestead but rarely visited it. The house was a 2-story craftsman that had seen better days. The roof leaked, the foundation had cracks, most of the windows were broken. Local kids said it was haunted. Everyone else just ignored it. Elias had the keys. Henry had given them to him years earlier, back when the family still thought someone might fix the place up. Henry lived in Mobile now, worked on the docks, and had no interest in the old house, except as something to leave to his children someday. On a moonless night in late October 1958, Elias backed his van up to the house and spent 4 hours unloading gold bars into the basement. He'd prepared for this moment. Weeks earlier, he'd quietly removed bricks from a section of the basement's foundation wall, creating a cavity large enough to hold all 23 bars. He'd lined the space with heavy canvas tarp to protect against moisture. He'd built a false wall in front of the cavity using old bricks and mortar that matched the existing foundation. He worked alone. He couldn't risk anyone knowing where the gold was hidden, not even his brothers. Trust was a luxury he couldn't afford. When the last bar was in place and the wall was sealed, Elias stood in that dark basement and made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He would leave the gold untouched. He wouldn't spend it, wouldn't move it, wouldn't touch it for years. Not until the heat died down completely. Not until everyone stopped looking, and in the meantime, he would become someone else. Elias Turner's disappearance was more calculated than anyone imagined. He didn't simply vanish, he orchestrated his own death. In early November 1958, Elias traveled to New Orleans under an assumed name. He found a man in the French Quarter, a drifter about his height and build, someone with no family, no permanent address, no one who would miss him. The details of what happened next were never fully clear, but what mattered was the result. Sometime in mid-November, a body was found in a drainage ditch outside Baton Rouge. The corpse was badly decomposed, partially burned, and dressed in clothes matching Elias Turner's description. A locket in the dead man's pocket contained photos of Elias and Jerome Turner. Local police, overwhelmed and understaffed, made a preliminary identification based on the personal effects and notified the FBI. Federal agents were skeptical, but cautious. Without dental records, Elias had never been to a dentist in his adult life, and with the body's condition so deteriorated, positive identification was impossible. Still, the discovery aligned with their theory that Elias had died shortly after the robbery. The case file noted the possible identification, but remained officially open. What no one knew was that Elias Turner was already gone, transformed into someone new. Using false papers he'd obtained months before the robbery, Elias became Thomas Briggs, a wandering handyman from Arkansas. He grew a thick beard. He gained weight. He adopted a slight limp, favoring his left leg as if from an old injury. He changed his speech patterns, his mannerisms, everything that made him recognizable. He drifted through small towns across the deep south, taking odd jobs that paid cash, staying in boarding houses and cheap motels. never remaining anywhere long enough to draw attention. He worked construction in Louisiana. He picked pecans in Georgia. He repaired farm equipment in Mississippi. He became invisible by becoming unremarkable. But every few months, Elias would make his way back to Brookwood. He'd approach the abandoned house under cover of darkness, entering through a loose board in the back. He'd descend into the basement with a flashlight and check the hidden wall, ensuring the bricks hadn't shifted, that no water had seeped in, that his fortune remained secure. Then he'd leave and disappear again into the anonymous crowds of working men who populated the rural South. For 3 years, Elias maintained this routine. He lived on almost nothing, saving every dollar he earned. He avoided relationships, avoided trouble, avoided anything that might create records or memories. He became a ghost, moving through the world, leaving no trace. Then, in 1961, everything changed. Henry Turner, Elias's uncle, died suddenly of a heart attack while working the docks in Mobile. He was 54 years old. His death was unexpected and left his family scrambling. Henry had 2 daughters, both married and living out of state. Neither wanted the old house in Brookwood. It was too rundown, too far from their lives, worth too little to justify the effort of selling it. The property sat vacant. Weeds overtook the yard. The porch collapsed. The house fell deeper into disrepair. And Elias saw an opportunity. Using his Thomas Briggs identity, Elias approached Henry's eldest daughter with an offer. He'd pay $500 cash for the property, taking it as is with no inspections or paperwork beyond a simple deed transfer. The daughter, eager to be rid of the burden, agreed immediately. By late 1961, Thomas Briggs, really Elias Turner, owned the house where his fortune was hidden. Now he could protect it properly. Elias moved into the house in early 1962, but not as a resident, as a caretaker. He told neighbors he'd been hired by the out-of-state owners to keep an eye on the place. He did minimal repairs, just enough to keep the structure from collapsing entirely. He kept the windows boarded, the doors locked, the property looking abandoned. He'd stay for a week or 2 at a time, then disappear for months, maintaining the illusion that he was just a transient worker passing through. During his stays, Elias would sit in that basement, surrounded by walls that held $2 million in gold, and contemplate his future. He'd expected to wait 5 years, maybe 10, before it was safe to move the bars. But as time passed, he realized something troubling. The longer he waited, the harder it became to imagine any scenario where he could actually use the gold without raising suspicion. The bars had serial numbers. They were federal property, stolen in one of the most publicized heists of the decade. Even if he waited 20 years, melting down or selling those bars would require connections to criminal networks he didn't have and didn't trust. And the moment he tried, he'd risk everything. Elias had planned the perfect robbery, but he'd never fully planned for what came after. The isolation began to wear on him. Years of constant vigilance, of living under a false identity, of never letting anyone close enough to see through the disguise. It took a toll that no amount of hidden gold could offset. Elias started drinking, not heavily at first, but steadily, enough to quiet the thoughts that kept him awake at night. He'd stolen $2 million and condemned himself to live like a pauper. He'd outsmarted the FBI, but trapped himself in a prison of his own making. The gold beneath the basement floor had become his jailer. In the summer of 1963, Elias made what would be his final visit to the house. Neighbors in Brookwood later recalled seeing lights in the windows for 3 or 4 nights straight, unusual for a property that typically sat dark for months at a time. On the last night, a truck was heard leaving the property around 2 in the morning. The engine sound faded into the distance, heading south. Then nothing. Thomas Briggs was never seen again. The house sat empty. For months, then years, then decades, the old Turner property remained abandoned. Teenagers occasionally broke in, exploring the dusty rooms and broken furniture. Homeless drifters sheltered there during winter storms, but no one ever discovered the hidden cavity in the basement wall. No one ever found the fortune sealed behind old bricks. The house became part of Brookwood's landscape, just another forgotten structure in a town full of them. Children who played in its yard grew up and moved away. The roof sagged further. Vines covered the porch. The property slowly disappeared beneath layers of neglect and time. And through it all, the gold waited. James Carter was 26 years old in 1978 when he and his wife Lila arrived in Brookwood, Alabama. James had grown up in rural Tennessee, learning carpentry and construction from his father. Lila had just finished her teaching degree at a small college in Georgia. They'd married young, full of optimism and short on money, looking for a place to build a life together. They'd heard about Brookwood through a friend, a quiet town with affordable housing and a school district that needed teachers. When they arrived, they found a community that had seen better days. The main street had more empty storefronts than open businesses. The population had been declining for years as younger people left for bigger cities. But James and Lila saw potential. They saw a place where a young couple could afford to own property, where Lila could teach and James could find construction work, where they could raise a family without the pressures of urban life. The problem was finding a house they could afford. That's when someone mentioned the old Turner property. It had been abandoned for over 15 years, slowly crumbling at the edge of town. The property was tied up in a complicated estate situation. Henry Turner's daughters had sold it decades earlier to someone named Thomas Briggs, but Briggs had never properly maintained it or paid property taxes. Eventually, the county had seized it for unpaid taxes. James went to look at the property on a Saturday morning in March. What he found was a disaster. The roof had multiple holes. Water damage had destroyed much of the interior. The foundation had visible cracks. Most people would have walked away immediately. But James saw the bones of something solid. The frame was still structurally sound. The foundation, despite cracks, was salvageable. The property itself was nearly 2 acres, with mature trees and good drainage. With enough time and effort, the house could be restored. He brought Lila to see it that afternoon. They stood together on the collapsing porch, looking at broken windows and peeling paint, and they saw their future. The county was eager to be rid of the property. They offered James a special arrangement. He could occupy the house and restore it gradually, and after 5 years of documented improvements and consistent habitation, ownership would transfer to him for the cost of back taxes, which amounted to less than $3,000. James and Lila accepted immediately. They moved in during April 1978, camping essentially in the one room where the roof didn't leak. James began repairs methodically, working room by room. He replaced rotted floorboards. He patched the roof. He installed new windows salvaged from demolition sites. Lila cleaned and painted, transforming water-stained walls into welcoming spaces. The basement was one of the last areas they addressed. It was dark, damp, and full of debris. James initially planned to simply seal it off, but Lila wanted proper storage space. So James spent weekends down there, clearing out decades of accumulated junk, old furniture, broken tools, newspapers from the 1950s. He looked at the foundation walls, noting the cracks and the mismatched brickwork in places. The house had clearly been repaired many times over its history. James mortared the visible cracks and reinforced weak sections. But he never thought to investigate why some bricks looked newer than others. He was focused on stability, not history. Above his head, sealed behind those bricks, 23 gold bars sat undisturbed. James and Lila Carter spent 15 years in that house. They finished the restoration within 3 years and gained full ownership in 1983. Their daughter Rachel was born in 1979, their son Michael in 1981. The children grew up in rooms their parents had rebuilt, playing in a yard their family had reclaimed from wilderness. The house became their life. They painted rooms when the kids started school. They added a deck when Michael turned 10. They replanted the garden every spring. Birthdays, holidays, ordinary Tuesday dinners. All of it happened within walls that held a secret the Carters never imagined. James worked construction jobs around Brookwood and neighboring towns. Lila taught 4th grade at Brookwood Elementary. They weren't wealthy, but they were comfortable. They'd achieved exactly what they'd set out to build: a stable, peaceful life in a home they'd made with their own hands. In 1992, James began planning a major renovation. The kids were teenagers now, needing more space. The basement was still unfinished, its ceiling too low and its foundation still showing age. James wanted to dig out the basement floor to create more headroom, update the old wiring, and create a proper rec room. He hired a local crew, 3 men he'd worked with on other jobs. The project was scheduled for summer 1993, when school was out and the weather was good for construction. On June 14, 1993, the crew began work. They started by removing old shelving units James had installed years earlier. Then they began the tedious process of breaking through sections of the foundation wall to install new support beams. The crew's foreman, a man named Robert Hayes, was working on the eastern wall when his sledgehammer broke through older bricks and hit something that didn't sound right. Instead of the solid thud of packed earth, he heard a hollow echo. Robert stopped and called James down to the basement. James examined the wall, tapping it with a hammer. The hollow sound was unmistakable. He assumed it was just a gap left by poor construction, maybe an old coal chute that had been sealed off. But curiosity got the better of him. He and Robert carefully removed more bricks. The mortar was old and crumbled easily. Within 20 minutes, they'd created an opening large enough to shine a flashlight through. The beam illuminated something wrapped in canvas tarp. James reached in and pulled out a heavy rectangular package. When he unwrapped the canvas, he found himself holding a gold bar stamped with federal markings and serial numbers. For a moment, everyone in that basement just stared. Then James went upstairs and called the sheriff. Within an hour, the Carter property was swarming with law enforcement. The county sheriff arrived first, followed by state police, and eventually by FBI agents from the Birmingham field office. They carefully extracted all 23 bars from the hidden cavity, documenting each one with photographs and detailed notes. The bars were in remarkable condition, protected from moisture by the canvas wrapping and the sealed cavity. Each bar weighed approximately 27 pounds and bore the distinctive markings of the Federal Reserve System. More importantly, each bar had a serial number stamped into its surface. FBI agents ran the serial numbers through their database that evening. The match came back within hours. The gold bars in the Carter basement were from the October 1958 federal transport. Robbery, one of the longest unsolved federal crimes in Alabama history. The discovery sent shockwaves through law enforcement. Agents who'd long since retired heard about the find and called their old colleagues, amazed. The case had been cold for 35 years. The gold assumed lost forever, either melted down or smuggled out of the country. Now here it was, exactly where it had been hidden 3.5 decades earlier, in a house that had been occupied for 15 of those years by a family who'd had no idea they were living above a fortune. The FBI immediately launched a renewed investigation. They pulled the original case files, contacted surviving witnesses, and began piecing together how the gold had ended up in that specific location. Property records revealed the connection. The house had originally belonged to Henry Turner, uncle to Elias Smoke Turner, the mastermind behind the 1958 robbery, who'd vanished without a trace. The trail showed Henry's daughters had sold the property in 1961 to someone named Thomas Briggs, but investigators couldn't find any records of Thomas Briggs beyond that single transaction. The name appeared nowhere else. No driver's license, no social security records, no employment history. It was, agents concluded, almost certainly a false identity. The pieces began to fall into place. Elias Turner hadn't fled to Mexico. He'd hidden the gold in his uncle's abandoned house, then somehow acquired the property under a false name to ensure it remained undisturbed. The plan had been brilliant in its simplicity. Hide the fortune in plain sight, in a house no one would suspect, protected by the simple fact of ownership. But something had gone wrong. Elias had disappeared in 1963, and the gold had remained hidden ever since. Investigators searched the property thoroughly. In the attic, they found a small wooden box containing old family photographs and documents. Among them was a handwritten letter on yellowed paper, the ink faded, but still legible. It was signed by Elias Turner and addressed to his uncle Henry, though it appeared Henry had never received it. The letter was brief, almost cryptic. It instructed Henry not to sell the property, to keep it in the family, to trust that everything would make sense eventually. The final line read simply, "If anything happens to me, don't come looking. Keep the house safe." The letter suggested Elias had intended to retrieve the gold eventually, but wanted insurance if something went wrong. He'd trusted his uncle to protect the property, never knowing Henry would die just a few years later, and the house would pass out of family hands. Then came the most disturbing discovery. A team searching the wooded area behind the house, using ground-penetrating radar, detected an anomaly in the soil about 50 yards from the back porch. They brought in forensic specialists who carefully excavated the site. Buried in a shallow grave, they found human remains. The skeleton was male, approximately 5 feet 10 inches tall, buried in clothing that dated to the early 1960s based on fabric and button design. In the dead man's shirt pocket, investigators found a tarnished locket containing 2 photographs, one of Elias Turner and one of a younger man identified by family as Jerome Turner, Elias's brother. Forensic analysis suggested the remains had been buried for approximately 30 years, placing the death around the same time Elias had disappeared. But here's where the mystery deepened. The skeleton's measurements didn't quite match Elias Turner's known physical profile. Elias had been approximately 6 feet tall with a broad build. This skeleton belonged to someone slightly shorter and lighter, without dental records for comparison. Elias had never visited a dentist as an adult, and with DNA testing still in its infancy in 1993, positive identification was impossible. The body was officially listed as unidentified male, possibly Elias Turner. The discovery raised more questions than it answered. Had Elias staged his own death using the body of an accomplice? Had he been killed by someone else who wanted the gold for themselves? The FBI developed several theories, but couldn't prove any of them conclusively. But that explanation didn't satisfy everyone involved in the investigation. In November 1993, 5 months after the gold was discovered, something strange happened. A clerk at a bank in New Orleans noticed unusual activity on an old account. Someone was attempting to redeem gold certificates using serial numbers that matched the stolen bars from the 1958 robbery. The person attempting to redeem them had used a false name, but the transaction required a signature. FBI handwriting analysts compared the signature to samples of Elias Turner's writing from the 1950s. Several experts noted striking similarities in the letter formation and overall style. If the signature belonged to Elias, it meant he was still alive in 1993. It meant the body in the shallow grave was someone else. The FBI launched a new manhunt, but the trail went cold almost immediately. The Carter family found themselves at the center of a media firestorm. Journalists descended on Brookwood, requesting interviews and taking photographs of the house. True crime enthusiasts and treasure hunters showed up unannounced. Their children were harassed at school by curious classmates and reporters. The federal government took possession of all 23 gold bars, classifying them as stolen federal property. The Carters received a finder's fee of $25,000, a modest sum given the fortune they'd discovered. In late 1994, the Carters made a difficult decision. They sold the property to a developer who planned to demolish the house. James, Lila, Rachel, and Michael moved to a newer home in a neighboring county, seeking the privacy and peace they'd lost. The old house was torn down in early 1995. Today, a small subdivision occupies the land where the Turner house once stood. Young families live there, unaware of the history beneath their feet. In the years following the discovery, investigators continued to examine every detail of the Turner case. What they found only deepened the mystery. A retired postal worker in Birmingham came forward in 1994. In the fall of 1962, he delivered a package to the Turner property addressed to Thomas Briggs. The man who'd answered the door matched Elias Turner's general description, but had a thick beard and walked with a pronounced limp. Another lead emerged in 1995. Dorothy Mitchell, widow of Jerome Mitchell, Elias's younger brother who'd been arrested after the robbery, contacted the FBI. Jerome had told her that Elias had once said the secret to disappearing wasn't running away, it was becoming someone so ordinary that no one would ever look twice. The most compelling evidence came in 1997. A true crime researcher discovered that in December 1963, a man matching Elias's description had been treated at Charity Hospital in New Orleans for severe pneumonia. The patient had given his name as Thomas Briggs. A forensic examiner concluded there was a 70% probability the signature matched Elias Turner's handwriting. If accurate, it meant Elias had been alive until at least December 1963. The theory was compelling, but unprovable. As the 20th century gave way to the 21st, the Turner case gradually faded from headlines. But for those who'd been touched by the case, the questions never fully went away. Rachel Carter went on to study criminology in college. She wrote her senior thesis on the Turner case, examining how someone could plan such an elaborate heist, yet fail to plan adequately for what came after. Michael Carter became a structural engineer. He occasionally gave interviews about the discovery, always emphasizing how surreal it had been to learn their entire childhood had been spent living above a hidden fortune. James and Lila Carter lived quietly in retirement. When asked, Lila would say that the discovery had been thrilling at first, then overwhelming, then just sad. She'd come to see Elias Turner not as a criminal mastermind, but as someone who destroyed his own life chasing something that ultimately meant nothing. The FBI's official position remained unchanged. Elias "Smoke" Turner was presumed deceased as of the mid-1960s. The case was closed. But the unofficial story held that Elias Turner had pulled off the impossible, not just the heist, but the escape. Some claim to have seen him over the years. None of the sightings were ever confirmed. In 2008, 50 years after the original robbery, a regional newspaper ran a retrospective on the case. One retired FBI agent admitted that the Bureau had never been entirely satisfied with the official conclusion. Too many loose ends remained. In 2015, the last surviving member of the original robbery crew died in prison. Raymond Hayes had served 57 years behind bars. Before his death, he granted a final interview to a documentary filmmaker. Hayes said that Elias had once told him the secret to a successful crime wasn't in the planning or the execution. It was in knowing when to stop. Most criminals failed because they couldn't stop. But Elias understood that the ultimate score wasn't about money. It was about freedom. The documentary aired in 2016, generating renewed interest in the case. Online forums developed elaborate theories about Elias's fate. None could be proven. Today, if you visit Brookwood, Alabama, you'll find a town that looks much like it did in 1978. The subdivision built on the old Turner property looks like 1,000 other subdivisions across the South. But sometimes, late at night, older residents will tell the story to visitors. Over time, the facts have blurred and transformed. Elias Turner has become a legend, a symbol of the impossible dream of complete escape. The gold bars from the 1958 robbery are displayed now in the FBI's Birmingham field office. The plaques tell the official story. Robbery in 1958. Gold hidden in Brookwood. Discovery in 1993. Perpetrator presumed deceased. Case closed. But the real story is more complicated. It's about a man who was smart enough to steal a fortune, but not wise enough to know what to do with it afterward. It's about a couple who built a life with honest work and stumbled into someone else's disaster. James Carter died in 2019 at the age of 67. Lila still lives in the house they bought after selling the Brookwood property. Sometimes her grandchildren ask about the gold. Lila tells them the truth as she understands it. The real treasure wasn't the gold bars at all. It was the 15 years of ordinary life, of family dinners and birthday parties, of all the small moments that make a house into a home. The gold had always been there, silent and patient, but it hadn't mattered. When it was finally discovered, it brought nothing but chaos. The fortune that Elias Turner had sacrificed everything to hide had ultimately harmed everyone it touched. Lila says she doesn't hate Elias Turner. She pities him. She imagines him sitting alone in that dark basement, surrounded by stolen gold he couldn't use, slowly realizing he'd traded his entire life for nothing. The story of Elias Turner has become part of Alabama folklore now. Tour companies in Birmingham sometimes include the story in their true crime tours, though there's nothing left to see in Brookwood. But the mystery endures. Did Elias Turner die in the 1960s, or did he successfully disappear? Who tried to redeem those gold certificates in 1993? The questions remain unanswered, and perhaps that's fitting. Some stories are better unfinished. Their endings left to imagination rather than fact. What's certain is this. On a June afternoon in 1993, a construction worker's sledgehammer broke through an old brick wall and exposed a secret that had waited 35 years to be found. The gold was recovered, the mystery remains, and somewhere, in records we haven't found, or graves we haven't marked, the full truth waits, patient as those gold bars had been patient, for someone to finally uncover it completely.